Hello and welcome to another Zach Carnage video. Now that the World Championships are over, the competitive season for 2017 and 2018 is pretty much complete. It was filled with a bunch of really epic moments, including a phenomenal World Championship final, and loads of decks taking events by storm, especially Burning Abyss, World Chaz popping up from basically nowhere. Now that the season is over, I'm bringing you my top 10 competitive decks from the 2017 and 2018 season. In 10th place is Burning Abyss, which won UK Nats and proved particularly popular at Euro shortly after that. So some of the pros for this deck: first of all, obviously surprise factor. Nobody's really expecting Burning Abyss to pop up at an event and really do anything significant there. Despite the fact that Dante obviously is surviving another ban list, he's still putting in a lot of work, and proves to be a pretty grindy deck despite the fact that there's new power creep coming in. It just seems to be the kind of thing that can do well at pretty much any event. With the release of Light of Sekka, you basically have Pot of Greed available for your deck. There's a whole bunch of hand traps that you can run to maintain a monster-heavy presence. There are so many power monsters like Rescue Cat, Tour Guide, and BLS as well. So you can set up your plays really consistently, as well as being able to remove problems from just single cards in a lot of cases. You can also, if you want, run Anti-Spell, which was often done pre-Light of Sekka, which allows you to really easily combat a lot of meta decks. There are a few issues with the deck. Obviously it's quite weak to Ghost Reaper and Winter Cherries. The boards that it sets up don't tend to be particularly strong. You only really get one Disrupt with your Beatrice, and it can struggle to OTK unless you draw into the non-searchable big main deck beaters like the BLS, or if you're running it, then the Orbital Hydrolander. Coming in at number 9 is Invoked. So there are a few interesting things about this deck. Obviously it's a very consistent engine where you can run 9 Alistairs, which allows you to start off your plays from very few cards within your hand. You can also run the most hand traps of pretty much any deck, or at least before the UK Nats format we saw that Invoked would tend to be the one that ran the most. You can generate some pretty easy OTKs, especially during the Pendulum format when it became particularly popular. It's also fairly accessible to achieve negates or disrupts onto your board thanks to the Ragin, but more importantly the Macabre. And it's probably one of the first decks that did actually use Scapegoats to its full potential. Some of the problems with this deck: you do have a heavy reliance on your opponent making plays in order to get your Mech Knight engine going, or make your hand traps actually do something. So it can be very weak turn 1, with people tending to make only one negate on the board. Obviously, when you're playing the Invoked engine, you don't really have spell or trap removal that's built into it. There's no sort of essential monster removal, so the engine itself doesn't really remove problems, and that's one of the big issues for the deck. But overall it's been very consistent. It's done a pretty good job throughout the year. It just hasn't ever really taken the world by storm, although it has done pretty well in the regional season. In 8th place we have Altergeist. This is a pretty interesting deck. Ever since it was released, people knew that it would eventually reach a state when it could compete in a meta scene, but obviously it didn't achieve that status for quite a while because it didn't have the support available. Some of the pros for this deck: all of the monsters have +1 effects except for, I suppose, Conqueree doesn't really have one. You're able to easily search and set up a lot of disrupts, including multiple negates for all types of effect on your first turn. Or at least going through on the second turn you can use your multi-figure to get to that stage. It's not hurt really by any of the popular hand traps. Ash is probably one of the most potent against this deck. However, you just sort of deal with that by setting up a protocol, and Droll does really nothing to this deck at all. You're also able to run the floodgates that can hinder other meta decks at the time, so you could run Anti-Spell when Trickstar Sky Striker lists were popular, and now you can run Rivalry of the Warlords, which is really good and doesn't hurt Altergeist in any way at all. However, the main deck monsters themselves aren't particularly strong. It can be quite hard for them to be able to beat over opposing creatures, and also it's kind of difficult for them to amass enough damage to lock out the game. You also can't play through monster effect negation because all of the removal that you have is monster based. You have your negates and your sort of floating ability through the traps, but it's very much your ability to get rid of opposing cards is from the Meluseek and from the Silcatus. So if your opponent shuts those off with an Inspector Border or an Amano Iwato, that can actually spell the game for you. That can be the end of it. It's a very strong deck, very consistent. It has some minor issues there, but definitely something that can be overcome within the next format. It just depends on how the other decks shape up, to be honest. This is definitely a contender for the upcoming season. In 7th place we have 60 cards, Light Swan Dino, Zombie variants, all those kinds of things. So this is one of the coolest decks I think that popped up during this season. You have near endless resources thanks to the release of Curious and the fact that Grass was still around at the time. It had very consistent, strong turn 1 boards, including a lot of disrupts that you could set up, and it was also very strong at going second, and you could OTK with it fairly easily. Just the fact that if you could Grass enough of a setup, or you could get off your plant combo, you would initially have so many resources available to you to be able to take down pretty much any board that was established within the game. For this deck, you're able to run multiple power cards in the deck, so you can run Desires, you can run Brilliant Fusion, obviously Grass and Soul Charger, all phenomenal cards, and they just work exceptionally well within this deck, and you can run all of them. It does require you having to run the most garnets or the most bricks of any deck that was out at the time, at least, so you could have entire hands of bricks. You can also auto-lose to some floodgates, things like Rivalry and Iron Wall would really shut off the deck. At the time it required probably the greatest knowledge of any deck to use at its fullest strength, so if you're someone like JY who's been practicing with the deck for a significant amount of time, you could basically play through anything. There are a lot of players who just sort of picked up the deck, but they didn't put in the time and effort to learn it properly, and then they didn't do particularly well. However, at the regional season, so the sort of like I suppose winter and spring of this year in particular, it did do extremely well in the regionals, especially in the UK, so it's definitely one of the stronger decks that we've had this year, and it'll be interesting to see if it does resurface in any shape or form. There were some smaller versions of the deck that came up at NATS. In 6th place we have Sky Striker, the pure version. So pros for this deck, the engine offers multiple types of outs for different kinds of boards, which is really versatile for it. Obviously it has extreme searchability, thanks to Kagari and Engage. Now you actually have access to Hayate as well, so it's even more, but obviously during the competitive season it didn't quite have that extra edge, so you could brick sometimes. Every card in the deck is a +1, except for Hornet, I suppose. The deck has a very, very strong grind game, thanks to the effect of multi-roll and the fact that you get additional searches from your Shizuku. It also has OTK potential, so once people realised that you could use Sky Blaster to set up an OTK, that really took the deck by storm. Some of the issues for this deck, before you had Hayate or when you were going first, if you didn't see Engage, then a single hand trap on something like your Shizuku could really shut you out of the game. The deck also attempts to search multiple times in the same turn, so it's a bit vulnerable to Droll. You only had 2 or 3 extra deck monsters, so it was very weak to Cherries. So heading into the top 5, in 5th place we're putting Trickstar Sky Striker. It has all of the benefits of the pure Striker version, but it's a more consistent build with 15 starter cards thanks to the very consistent Trickstar engine. It was popular at a time when every deck was searching almost every single turn, so everything would be extremely vulnerable to Reincarnation, which meant that the fact that you had all of these copies of Reincarnation in your deck, plus you could play Mind Crush as well, was a massive deal for opponents to have to deal with. You also had the consistent 2-card OTK that was out at the time, which required you to simply have a 6-of through the Engage on the Hornet and a 9-of through a Candina in order to set that up, and that would be really strong and just steal games out of basically nowhere. It was also popular at a time when lots and lots of back row was being set, especially in the mirror matches as well. So Light Stage suddenly became much more powerful because it had that additional effect of back row removal. So if you're in a format where the back row isn't particularly popular, Light Stage doesn't do quite as much. But they got a bit lucky in that it was certainly a time when people were using a lot of spells and traps. The burn damage also, when end of match procedures was updated, that was a huge deal for a lot of people. You could take games basically off people just drawing for their turn. Which led to a lot of Trickstar decks just winning from kind of silly game states, to be honest. Some of the problems with it, obviously Trickstars are all very weak, so if your opponent summons something that's like 1900 or more, then you can kind of lose out in that position if you don't see the Striker engine. The deck does also search a lot in any single turn, so it is extremely vulnerable to Droll, more so than the pure Striker version. But that said, it's an extremely strong deck. It's had a phenomenal performance throughout the year, and it's well deserved. In fourth place is True Draco. I'm putting this in because it's the kind of deck where you simply had to have all of the cards and be fairly competent in order to win. The popular use of Amano Iwata in the draw cards, especially Demise, when anti-draw hand traps were popular, made this deck really good. And it actually forced the play of Typhoon, particularly in the UK metagame. The engine includes outs to all of the card types, even monsters immune to effect destruction thanks to the actual effect of Apocalypse. You're able to run the best floodgates available to combat Pendulum, which is obviously when this deck became the most popular. Masterpiece being around, that immunity made a lot of matchups really strong. If you could just summon this with Trap Monster Immune against Altergeist, or maybe Spell Monster Immune against something like Trickstar, or Pure Strikers, that kind of thing, before Peace got banned, that would be an enormous deal, and it would be really hard for them to be able to combat you, and it wouldn't be so much that you had to outplay them, you just have to put this monster onto the board, and then you can suddenly win at that point. So when it was most popular, it did have the case that you could just ignorantly win matches, certainly, but in order to win events you had to play the mirror matches, and those were extremely skillful, and they took a lot of time and effort for people to think out and work out how to deal with those. Some of the issues: the engine itself requires a monster and something to tribute, so it does get a bit inconsistent without the draw cards, and you can sometimes have easy losses if your opponent sees a hand trap that deals with something and you don't yourself see an Amano. The engine did not put out significant damage, so there weren't many OTK options for it. The extra deck helped out with this a little bit. And also there was a lot of back row hate readily available within the format. Things like Red Reboot became available, Twin Twisters was available throughout the entire format, it's evenly matched as well. So that was very accessible to players and important for taking out the resources from Draco players. But that said, the deck did extremely well, especially in the Pendulum format, just because it was very, very good at combating that meta. In third place, we have Pendulum Magicians. Some of the pros for this deck: you put out the multiple negate boards. You're very, very consistently going to be able to make big boards that can OTK your opponent, even through a lot of the hand traps that were popular in the formats. The FTK deck obviously did exist for a while, which was exceptionally consistent for an FTK, easily beating out the Gemini FTKs. The mechanic itself, also allowing that recursion of monsters to maintain strong board presence in the grind game, makes us one of the best decks for grinding through different situations as well. Obviously it does have weaknesses, things like anti-spell, hand traps on the Electromite, and particularly Draco at the time, which would just put out a lot of floodgates that could deal with you, and that basically essentially immune Masterpiece with the disrupt. But Pendulum Magician has been extremely strong throughout the format. It's still strong at the moment, and it'll be interesting to see if it gets hit on the ban list or if it will carry on just doing an extremely good job of beating a lot of the meta decks. So first and second were tied for a little while. I've gone with second being Spiral, specifically the 4-power version that it had available. So in US you had the Tri-Gate combos with Link Rebo, and the boards that you could put out were absolutely insane. You'd have Disrupts, you'd have Negates, and it was virtually impossible for your opponent to be able to deal with this, really. You had a large number of starter cards, and it's also really good at going second. It has always had a weakness to hand traps on Helix, which meant that you'd have like 15 hand traps in your Spiral decks. Another thing was the rise of Trickstar at the time when Spiral was popular, just because Reincarnation could take away games from you if you did decide to run this deck, but it's been really strong throughout. It has a lot of really cool cards and really provides some very interesting matches as well. So, in first place for this list, obviously, you thought that this would be taking the top spot. It is, of course, a Goki. Some of the best things about this deck: you can make extra link boards, including a Negate, which can't be targeted or destroyed. Almost any 2 cards within the deck can start the combo, thanks to Invoker being around as well. You have space for 6+ hand traps within the deck. You can play through 1 of any of the most common hand traps, sometimes 2, depending on your hand. And you can even leave your opponent with only 2 cards to play with, thanks to Gumblar. There is actually a combo that sets up a Gumblar, which is immune to, I think it's destruction and targeting, with a working Tri-Gate on board, and I think you can have a Phoenix on as well, which is really, really tough to deal with because your opponent is playing off 2 cards and one of those will be negated. So I think that's kind of the thing that puts the Goki ahead of anything else, is the option to play Gumblar in it as well. It's also one of the best decks for OTKing. It's got a very, very consistent ability to OTK and to deal with problem cards on the field because you have such easy access to the Nightmare monsters. I think the only real con for this deck is you use up virtually the entirety of the extra deck and even the main deck as well in order to set up the combo. So if your board is outed by Sphere Mode or something, then it's virtually impossible to recover, but it's so hard for your opponent to get to a state where they can actually get rid of that, so the Goki definitely taking first place for this list. It's consistent, it's strong, and it puts out something that I don't think any other deck has been able to thanks to Gumbler. So this is a look at the evolution of the meta from 2017 to 2018, specifically the YCS events and the NATS events that all had top cuts available online. There is actually one top 8 in here, which is a bit unfortunate because most of this is top 32 and top 64, but you can see right at the start of the season we had Zoo still around, so it gets in a couple of places there, with Zoo taking most of the spots at the first YCS. I think this was Rimini, and then moving onwards, Spiral taking the top spot thanks to the release of Double Helix, where it just completely took control of the meta, winning and dominating most events that were available. Trickstar did rise a bit in popularity in response to this, and Pendulum was still very strong at the start of this season. But Pendulum certainly went down in popularity as Spiral was spotted as the best deck. Moving on from that, obviously the ban list hit Spiral significantly. Pendulum rose up as still being a very strong combo deck that can do all those OTKs. In response to this, Trickstar has an interesting matchup versus it, so that hung around a bit. But also, especially True Draco gained a lot of popularity, especially in regional events, but mostly what we're seeing here is in the larger scale events, where it did extremely well against Pendulum thanks to the ability to set the floodgates and just win from there. Then we had the release of Strikers, so Sky Striker Trickstar, suddenly you see this giant spike at the end. That's where it really took off. Around the start of that, we did have pure Sky Strikers coming in as well, but people realized that the Trickstar variant was just more consistent and generally better, so that kept on rising up whilst the pure version dropped in popularity. Right at the start of this, actually, Goki was realized and spotted to be a potentially really strong deck, but shortly afterwards, most people latched on to the victories of the Sky Striker Trickstar variant, so people just dropped Goki without really realizing it to its full potential at the time, despite the fact that most of the cards were available. Then during this period, you can see this little dot here from the Mech Knight Sky Striker Trickstar variants. So people worked out that you could win your mirror matches essentially by teching in a bunch of Mech Knights. But then following that, you can see the Sky Striker Trickstars dropping in popularity as Goki picked up in popularity because people realized that you had a very easy matchup if you played Goki against any of the Sky Striker Trickstar variants, and that brought us up to the end of the season. I haven't included the World Championship on this because it's such an unusual event. This is just focused on the TCG. So overall, 2017 and 2018 was a surprisingly diverse competitive season. Whilst regionals were ongoing, a wide variety of decks were able to compete and take top spots. However, by the time that national events had rolled around, Trickstar Sky Striker had secured an extremely strong foothold in the EU regions, with Goki rising to power in the US thanks to Linkuriboh. And these two decks dominated the end of the season. When Linkuriboh was finally released in the EU, Goki shot up to be the #1 around here, specifically the rank 3 build because we don't have the Summon Sorceress available. With all of the continental championships over, the World Championship started up, and thanks to the combined ban list, we saw another myriad of decks taking a hold, with Trickstar narrowly rising to the top over Altergeist in the final. Without a new list released, we don't know how the coming season is going to be shaping up, but we can expect that very soon. There are plenty of old and new decks with phenomenal potential, especially the ones on this list just waiting to take the season by storm. So thanks for watching this video.